Now, our next speaker is Nick Bainton, who's also online. I won't give him too much of an introduction because we're running a bit behind time. I think a lot of you would know him. He's done some great work on the interaction between mining and communities, and he's going to talk about just transitions today. So I'll let you get into it. Nick, your screen is up. Thanks.
Right. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've led with Professor Deanna Kemp and Professor John Owen and Dr. Eleanor Lebre. And this has been a piece of work funded by the Complex Ore Bodies program, so very appreciative of that. And it was an opportunity really for some exploratory work. And we wanted to understand this concept that's starting to emerge and gain traction, this idea of a just transition, and then what that means for the global mining industry. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the project. Then I'm going to talk about or unpack this concept of a just transition, talk about what it means for the industry or what we found as we looked into it and what we think it means and how the industry is starting to engage with it, and then give a sense of some of the initial outputs and how we're moving forward. So, as I said before, the idea was to explore this concept of a just transition to a low carbon future. And we really wanted to not only understand how the industry is engaging with it, but also to interrogate the concept and start to think about it in relation to the body of work that we've built up here in the SMI, and particularly the work that's being led through Complex Ore Bodies with thinking about some of those source level risks associated with the sourcing of energy transition metals. So at the point of extraction, given that those metals are necessary component of the current solutions for climate change, for building low carbon energy systems. So we wanted to then run this concept through some of those realities and dynamics. So for those of you who have not heard of the concept or have heard of it briefly but are not quite sure, we can generally define it as a fair and equitable process of moving towards a post-carbon society. So it's quite a broad ambition and quite a broad concept. And that's underpinned by the idea that any action we take on climate change shouldn't create new forms of impacts or new inequalities or new injustices, that we shouldn't be burdening one set of workers or communities or one particular country. And with that emphasis, it really then puts a much stronger focus on the social and justice considerations that would be entailed in a global energy transition. So while we've got a lot of talk and a lot of commitment at one level around having a global energy transition and the need for that, there's less clarity around how we would ensure that it's a just and fair process. Importantly, the concept, it helps to address some of the political impasse between the jobs versus environment political discourse and those sorts of arguments, because it says it's not one or the other, but we must have both. We must find a way as part of transitioning to also create new jobs, to create clean and green jobs, decent forms of work, and that this is an opportunity for essentially reimagining work at the same time. The background on the concept is that it emerged in the 1970s and 80s out of the US labour movement or the labour environmental movements. So unlike a lot of common current usage of the term, which tends to attribute the term to thinking about the ethical dimensions of transitioning out of fossil fuels, transitioning out of coal, thinking about those dimensions with coal communities in decline. The the concept actually emerged in a context that wasn't driven or focused around coal. So it was the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers International Union. And Tony Mazzocchi, who was the leader of the union at the time, he's generally attributed with coining this term. And what he was putting forward, or the union were putting forward at that time, was the need for essentially a super fund, because as there were new environmental regulations being introduced, this created threats for workers, and they were pushing for the interests of labour, saying, well, what can the government put forward in terms of safeguarding our interests, retraining us, providing a safety net, providing transition funds to assist us as part of the package of introducing stronger environmental regulation. The concept has really been mainstreamed quite significantly in the last 5 years or so, and it got its strongest political endorsement in the 2016 Paris Climate Agreement, where it was included in the preamble, and then later reinforced in 2018 at COP24. And that was embedded in the Silesia Declaration, which states that a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs are crucial to ensure an effective and inclusive transition to low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development, and to enhance the public support for achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. As you can see from this table here, there's been a very rapid explosion of academic interest in this topic. So it's bubbled along in the early 2000s and prior to that with only a handful of publications. And then around the time that the Paris Climate Agreement included the need for a just transition, you see this really rapid uptake. And that trajectory is really, it's been continuing since we've been looking at it earlier in the year. There's been multiple publications that have come out just in the last few months. And it's really been dominated by broadly the social sciences and environmental sciences, earth sciences and energy. And in that convergence between thinking about climate justice, environmental justice, and energy justice. What are the implications for the industry? There's, from our read at least, there's probably a stronger set of implications and a moderate set of implications. And that's somewhat based on how different groups might be defining the idea of a just transition, whether they're taking a stronger read or a more radical read on the idea of a just transition, or whether there's a more, you could say, a weaker read on it, which might only entail consideration of creation of jobs in a green economy, as opposed to thinking about a much larger overhaul of our entire political economy. So the moderate implications would be that we expect that there'll be growing pressure to demonstrate alignment with the concept, and to demonstrate attention to social considerations as part of climate, the ways in which extractive companies are acting on climate change. So at a minimum, we're going to see companies start to talk and try and demonstrate how they're aligning with the concept. The stronger implications would be that other civil society groups and other organisations will use this as the normative base to mobilise a much larger and more sustained set of movements against the mining industry. It'll go beyond coal. It'll be more than just about divesting from coal. It'll be used as a way of holding the industry to account for a much broader set of harms, past, present and future harms of extraction across many different commodity types. From the work that we were doing and trying to interrogate the idea of what sort of justice or notion of justice underpins the concept of a just transition, for us a stronger read was that it would entail attention to both, or to the distributional, procedural and restorative dimensions of justice. So that starts, once you open it up like that, it really starts to force you to think about how are the impacts of extraction or a global energy transition, how are they distributed, what are the procedural issues or injustices that start to emerge, such as free, prior and informed consent at the community level for new projects, people's access to remedy or grievance mechanisms, for example. And then the restorative dimensions to this, how would you start to consider reparations for harm, if that's a fundamental aspect of a just transition? The limitations with the concept are that in its more mainstream versions, which tends to focus on the need for creating jobs as part of a transition out of the fossil fuel industries, is that there's both at an international level, there's a limited level of consensus around the meaning and what kind of process of transition this should entail, and who should be responsible for implementing a just transition. At the ideas level, it's likely to become a contested concept in the way that sustainable development has been, or potentially what you could call an empty signifier, in that it could be picked up and used by lots of different groups for different purposes and to emphasise different dimensions of a transition. And then crucially, and this is where our work has really built on some of the foundational work from the Complex Ore Bodies program, is that when we start to look at the global demand or increased demand for energy transition metals in order to put in place and to establish clean energy systems, and the sorts of risks and the extensification of injustices and the distribution of impacts that would come with increased mining, then we start to see that mainstream versions of a just transition concept really don't match that reality, or they tend to skip over it. So in the name of an urgent green transition, we start to then forget about those justice dimensions. So it starts to be, what's sitting behind the mainstream version is potentially the acceptance that there will be sacrifice zones. Mining industry engagement with the just transition at this stage is very, very much in its infancy. From a review of public documents, and so that's reports, websites, policies, media statements, we really couldn't find any kind of substantive engagement with the concept. But it is evident that companies are starting to test the concept, that they're trying it on for size, they're using it in different ways to sort of signal, almost virtue signaling, you might say, that we're thinking about transitioning from coal, or we're putting in measures to divest, and we call that a just transition. So for one example, the way Anglo-American CEO has talked about it. You take that and you compare that to the energy sector, there's quite a strong difference. So BP has gone all the way of embedding the idea of a just transition into their human rights policy. So that's quite a strong development. So at this stage, the mining industry has not come that far on the journey in terms of thinking about, well, what does this mean for us and how we operate? Our outputs from this work at this stage, so this has culminated in an article that we've submitted to Sustainable Development. It's provided an opportunity for cross-collaboration across UQ, so with Professor Greg Marsden from School of Social Science, who's been leading a program of work around the future of work, which very much ties into some of the core themes in a just transition. And what we wanted to do in this initial piece was really trace out the historical thinking around this idea, a little bit of the genealogy of the term and the concept, and then place it within its historical context. And so what we were then seeing is that the idea of a just transition really serves as a kind of counter movement in response to the global ecological crisis. And as I said before, we see that these mainstream versions, they kind of jump over, or the mainstream discourse jumps over these problems of the source metal supply. So that's really quite a major contradiction in terms of our current transition pathways and the ways in which we're then talking about it. We, as a result of interrogating the idea of justice that underpins it, we landed on John Rawls's work on justice as fairness, and we found that as being critical to the larger goals of the just transition, but also provides a more expansive way then of thinking about justice dimensions that would be entailed in as part of an energy transition. So finally, so how are we building on this? As I said before, that the concept, it is broad, but the value of that is it aligns with our existing work of SMI and CSRM, and it does encompass the concerns around sustainable and responsible mining practices. It gives us a lever that we can pull as we think about those considerations, and particularly to that justice lens, I think will provide, in some ways, a more concrete lever and a more concrete concept as opposed to sustainable development, which has become much more broad and loose. Of course, there is the flip side, as I said before, that it will be a contested concept. I think going forward, an immediate task for us is to track how industry and other organisations use this term, and ourselves, how we use it, and for what purposes. And certainly, I can see a lot more opportunity out of this for further collaboration across UQ, because it ties into a number of different concerns around addressing the crisis of climate change, but also the practical and social and moral realities that accompany that. So we'll leave it there for now. Take any questions if we have time.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That's incredibly interesting, certainly for me, despite, I guess, as your plot showed, that term just transition has been coming into the literature since 2016. I certainly hadn't heard a lot about it, so that's a fantastic overview. Thanks very much for that, Nick.